At the sleek glass front desk of Northgate Logistics, nestled in Seattle's thriving commercial district, Arielle Donovan typed briskly as the early morning light bounced off her gold-rimmed glasses. Her crisp navy blue blouse matched the firm's professional aesthetic, but her heart pulsed with a rhythm entirely her own, full of ambition and restlessness. Most employees barely noticed the receptionist beyond her welcoming smile and impeccable call routing skills, but Arielle was different. She wasn't simply clocking hours. Tucked inside her purse, under a modest leather journal, was a detailed blueprint for her dream business, a private executive concierge security firm. Born out of watching her late mother suffer under poor protection during a home break-in years ago, Arielle vowed to one day offer something better, elite, precise, discreet protection services, not driven by fear but by proactive intelligence. For now, she was invisible in this high-rise of polished egos and sharp suits, but she observed everyone, learning how business, betrayal, and human behavior intertwined. She was biding time. Her time. Raised in a quiet part of Tacoma by her father Stanley Donovan, a retired corrections officer, Arielle was the eldest of two. Her mother, Lenora, once a local teacher, had passed from cardiac arrest when Arielle was 17, a loss that left a crater in their family's rhythm. Stanley, hardened by years in the system but soft for his children, fell into silent depression. Arielle stepped up, balancing school, part-time jobs, and being a mother figure to her then-teenage brother, Trevor, whose grief eventually spiraled into addiction. Even after earning a communications degree from Seattle State, Arielle couldn't afford grad school or the startup capital to chase her security firm dream. So she took the receptionist job at Northgate, humble, unnoticed, but strategic. It was here she could learn from wealthy clients, overhear decision-making calls, and analyze how corporate empires were built from scratch. Every lunch break was a training ground. Every executive name was noted. She was planting seeds in silence, waiting for the day she'd bloom where no one expected. The day Graham Whitaker walked in with the pool consortium client team, Arielle didn't expect anything out of the ordinary. Another tall, suit-clad man with a briefing folder and charisma, until he paused, met her eyes, and offered a polite but warm smile that lingered longer than it should have. Arielle dismissed it as routine politeness, but something about his calm, measured voice and the faint scar near his temple made her curious. Graham, a newly promoted operations analyst, had recently joined Pool after leaving a troubled tech startup. He noticed Arielle not as background, but as someone in control despite the underestimated position. Over the next few weeks, his visits to Northgate became more frequent. He began engaging Arielle in brief, respectful conversation about books, music, even her opinions on executive behavior. Arielle, cautious but intrigued, found herself laughing at his wit. Neither of them realized then that their quiet rapport was laying the groundwork for something far more complicated, and ultimately devastating, than either of them was prepared for. Graham Whitaker stared at the worn photo in his wallet as the town car pulled into Pool Consortium's underground garage. It was of his older brother, Maxwell, who had died in a private plane crash 7 years ago while managing a Whitaker real estate portfolio in Brazil. Graham had been the creative one, an impulsive tech savant who dropped out of Columbia after a failed app nearly bankrupted his investor uncle. Maxwell had been the golden boy. After his death, Graham was expected to become him. His mother, Cynthia Whitaker, never said it aloud, but every glance, every disappointed sigh, made the pressure suffocating. Graham had clawed his way back to corporate respectability through quiet diligence, shedding the rebellion that once defined him. But beneath his clean suits and measured voice was a man who still didn't feel enough. The day he noticed Arielle Donovan behind the front desk, poised, composed, eyes alert, was the first time in years someone looked at him without comparing him to a ghost. The work conference at Bainbridge Peninsula was supposed to be another dreary 2-day retreat, name badges, keynote talks, catered lunches, repeat. But Graham's chest tightened when he saw Arielle's name on the Northgate delegation list. She looked stunning in an emerald green wrap dress during the welcome mixer, but it wasn't just the outfit, it was the way she held her own during Candace, the way she listened fully before speaking. That night, after a speaker's mic malfunction halted the banquet early, Graham asked her to join him for a walk along the Marina boardwalk. They talked for hours. Arielle shared about her mother, her fears of failing her brother, and her secret dream of building something greater. Graham opened up about the accident that took Maxwell, how he sometimes wished he'd been on that plane instead. There was no flirtation, no forced charm, just two fractured souls talking in unfiltered honesty. And that kind of connection? It was rare. Dangerous, even. Especially for someone with as many buried secrets as Graham. When Graham returned to Seattle the next morning, he found himself searching for excuses to see Arielle. He emailed regarding a project update that didn't require her, stopped by reception with coffee for the whole team, and even lingered by the elevators just to catch a glimpse. But it wasn't just attraction, it was grounding. She made him feel real, human, not just another puppet in Cynthia's carefully constructed legacy. Yet, even as he pursued Arielle's warmth, he kept walls around his past. He never spoke of Shayla, the woman he once almost married before discovering she had betrayed his brother. He never mentioned that Cynthia still paid his rent on a penthouse he loathed. He presented a version of himself he wished were true, stable, honest, healed. Arielle, in her trust, began to soften toward him, unaware she was falling for a man still tethered to shadows. And Graham, despite his best intentions, was not ready to tell her how many miles he still had to walk toward becoming the man she believed him to be. Marina Cheng burst into the lobby of Northgate Logistics just 5 minutes before closing, wearing scrubs splashed with dried iodine and a ponytail frizzed from a 12-hour orthopedic shift. She waved at security like she owned the place, ignoring their standard protocol, and beelined straight to reception. Arielle looked up from her screen with tired eyes and a knowing smile. This was typical Marina, her best friend since college, a bulldozer of truth in a world of pretense. With Chinese-Korean roots and a New York tongue, Marina was unapologetically blunt, fiercely protective, and the only person who knew every jagged inch of Arielle's past. They'd bonded in a freshman dorm hallway over late-night ramen and childhood grief. Marina had lost her father to cancer the same year Arielle lost her mom. That evening, Marina pulled Arielle out of her post-conference days and into a booth at Moe's Diner, where she grilled her mercilessly about Graham. "You trust him?" she asked, eyes narrowed. Arielle hesitated, and Marina didn't miss it. 2 days later, Marina's younger cousin, Elias Chang, dropped by Northgate with coffee for his cousin, only to find Arielle at the desk alone. Tall, reserved, and sharp-eyed, Elias jebbled classes at the School of Architecture with 2 bartending gigs and freelance drafting for local design firms. He didn't say much, but the way he glanced at Arielle carried the softness of someone watching from a distance. Unlike Graham's polished confidence, Elias was quiet and intentional, moving like someone who knew what it felt like to be overlooked. He and Arielle spoke briefly, mostly small talk about traffic and Marina's overtime chaos, but that brief encounter left a dent in his day. Later that evening, Marina teased him, joking that he had a thing for women who could outplan a missile strike. Elias didn't deny it. He remembered the way Arielle had said thank you when he handed her the coffee, as though no one had done something kind for her in weeks. It made something tighten in his chest. Meanwhile, at home, Arielle's world frayed quietly beneath her strong facade. Trevor, her 25-year-old brother, was fidgeting more, disappearing at odd hours, and dodging conversations. He insisted he was attending NA meetings, but Arielle could smell the deceit. She knew his patterns. Still, she said nothing, unwilling to push him back into shame. One night, she found his door locked and the sound of muffled sobs. Instead of confronting him, she sat outside the door, back against the wall, and whispered stories from their childhood until his sobs faded. Her loyalty to her family was unshakable, even if it hurt. When Graham visited later that week and met Stanley, Arielle's father, the meeting was stiff. Stanley, stoic and no-nonsense, eyed Graham like a parole officer appraising an inmate's apology. After Graham left, Stanley said simply, "He's too smooth." Men like that, they're used to walking away when things get hard. Arielle didn't answer. But the words clung to her long after the night had ended. The Whitaker estate in Madrona Heights looked more like a contemporary art museum than a home, glass panels rising from sculpted marble, walls lined with abstract pieces worth more than Arielle's yearly salary. Graham's invitation to dinner had come casually over a text. "My mother wants to meet you," but Arielle had felt the tremor in her bones the second she stepped onto the imported slate floors. Cynthia Whitaker, tall and polished like a fashion editorial brought to life, greeted her with a smile so flawless it felt paper-thin. "So you're the young woman from the front desk," she said, with an elegance that made insult sound like compliment. Dinner was served by a uniformed staff, the menu curated by a private chef flown in from Napa, and every moment of the meal was lined with backhanded compliments and subtle slights. Arielle, dressed in a modest navy sheath and vintage earrings from her mother, held her own, until Cynthia brought up prenups, inheritance, and knowing your place in legacy. Graham tried to smooth things over with tense chuckles and quick subject changes, but Arielle could feel his shoulders tightening as the courses dragged on. Cynthia, sensing weakness, began recalling stories about Shayla Caldwell, Graham's ex-fiancée, who understood the weight of real family expectations. She spoke as though Shayla had never broken off the engagement after a mysterious scandal Cynthia conveniently skipped over. Arielle sat still, biting into her roasted duck with calm restraint, her silence louder than any rebuttal. Across the table, she noticed Wallace Whitaker, Graham's father, nursing his wine and watching the exchange with tired detachment, as if this circus had played out before. The night ended with Graham walking Arielle to her car and apologizing profusely. She didn't cry. Not there. But as soon as she got home, she stood under the shower until the water ran cold, her fingers shaking, not from sadness, but from anger. This wasn't just a disapproving parent. This was a woman who planned legacies the way generals planned wars. What Graham did next surprised her. 2 weeks later, without another grand Whitaker dinner or family prelude, he took her on a trip to the Olympic Peninsula. They rented a quiet cabin overlooking the forest ridge, and on the second night, under a sky streaked with lavender and gold, Graham knelt with a ring he claimed had belonged to his grandmother. "I don't want legacy," he whispered. "I want a life. With you." Arielle stared at the ring, then at him, searching his face for cracks, for hesitation. But in that moment, she saw only sincerity. She said yes, and they kissed under the wind-stripped stars. What she didn't know was that behind that ring was a storm that hadn't passed, just one that had changed direction. Back in Seattle, Shayla had returned to town. Cynthia had already made contact. And while Arielle slept beside her fiancé with hope blooming in her chest, a web of carefully spun betrayal was beginning to tighten. It started with a photo. Marina, always protective and rarely wrong, called Arielle late one evening from the parking lot of the Mondrian Towers, an exclusive apartment complex on the north side of Seattle. She'd just finished an overnight shift and, while waiting for her ride, spotted Shayla Caldwell, the same Shayla who'd once been engaged to Graham, stepping into the private elevator with a man whose back looked disturbingly familiar. Marina took a photo discreetly through her side mirror, and though the man's face wasn't clear, the posture and gray coat matched the one Graham wore just hours earlier when he told Arielle he was in Portland for a supply chain audit. "You're going to say it's coincidence," Marina warned, but Arielle, just look at the timestamp. Arielle stared at the image for what felt like hours, her throat dry, her chest tight. She didn't want to believe it, but the math wasn't matching. And her instincts, dulled by hope, began to stir. Later that week, Elias Cheng arrived at the Wavelength Lounge, his side gig as a bartender, only to spot Graham walking in with 2 men from the pool consortium and none other than Shayla, laughing as if she belonged. Elias watched them from behind the bar, wiping glasses and memorizing details. Graham ordered his usual whiskey neat, sat beside Shayla, and introduced her to his colleagues as a family friend. Shayla touched his wrist when she laughed. She leaned in too close. When they left, Elias followed discreetly to the valet lot and watched Shayla slide into Graham's black SUV. That same night, he texted Marina everything. The next morning, Marina showed Arielle the messages, the timestamps, the security photo. Still, Arielle clung to Graham's version of the story, that Shayla had shown up uninvited at a business dinner and he was too stunned to make a scene. "I should have told you sooner," he said. "I just didn't want to ruin our week." Arielle, emotionally exhausted, chose trust, but her voice shook when she said, "Okay." Hoping to silence the doubt, Arielle threw herself into wedding preparations. She confirmed bookings with florists, ordered personalized gold-accented invitations, and secured a Saturday date at the Glasswood Conservatory, a botanical marvel of curved glass and cascading orchids. It was a place she'd dreamed of since she was 16, a place she'd once thought too expensive for someone like her, until Graham insisted on covering everything. And still, something felt off. Shayla's presence began surfacing in subtle ways. Arielle received an anonymous gift, a bottle of rare perfume she hadn't worn in years, with no card, just a tag that read "For the bride who's second to none." That same day, her appointment with the dress designer was inexplicably canceled, rescheduled without her consent. When she confronted the studio, they nervously mentioned a Ms. Caldwell confirming changes. Arielle's stomach twisted, but she told no one. After all, the wedding was weeks away. And no one ruins the dream when you've come too far to start over. Right? The call came at 2:17 a.m. from a blocked number. Arielle stirred from half-sleep, her phone buzzing on the nightstand beside the bridal magazine she'd left open to cake options. The voice on the other end was deep, impersonal, and stern. "Your brother has been detained at SeaTac. We need someone here immediately." Arielle's stomach dropped. She arrived at the airport in leggings and Graham's hoodie, her hair tied in a loose bun, heart pounding as she hurried through security gates toward the Customs and Border Protection Office. Trevor sat slouched in a plastic chair, wrists cuffed, eyes bloodshot, a duffel bag on the table beside him. Inside that bag, 3 refurbished iPhones, a set of unregistered tracking devices, and a small pouch of cash and foreign bills. "What the hell, Trevor?" she whispered, devastated. He stammered, claimed it wasn't his, that a friend had asked him to deliver a package for cash. Arielle knew this pattern. It was always someone else's fault. Always. After hours of tense questioning and legal warnings, Trevor was released under Arielle's custody pending further investigation. On the ride home, the silence in the car was thick and jagged. Trevor clutched his hoodie like armor while Arielle gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. "You were clean," she said finally, voice shaking. "You promised me you were done." He looked out the window, avoiding her gaze, then muttered, I just messed up, okay?" That wasn't enough. Not anymore. When they arrived home, Graham was waiting on the porch. His expression hardened the moment he saw Trevor. "He can't be at the wedding," Graham said bluntly, even before Arielle explained. "Arielle, your family's drama, his issues, this isn't the time for you to keep playing the savior." Arielle stared at him, stunned, wounded. She had expected understanding. Instead, she saw judgment. Trevor said nothing, retreating into the house like a ghost. And in that moment, Arielle realized she was being asked to choose between the man she planned to marry and the boy she had practically raised. The next morning, Marina came over unannounced, storming into the kitchen with a box of donuts and fire in her eyes. When Arielle told her what had happened, Marina cursed, paced, and slammed her palm against the counter. "He knew Trevor's history. He knew what you went through. He doesn't get to cherry-pick your loyalty." Arielle didn't disagree, but she was exhausted, torn between protecting the last blood family she had and preserving the fragile dream she'd built with Graham. That evening, she went for a long walk alone, drifting past bridal shops and late-night diners, her heart heavy. She sat on a bench outside Glenrose Park, staring into the dark skyline, wondering how many pieces of herself she'd have to surrender to make this wedding happen. The dream was cracking. Not in an obvious way, but like glass under slow pressure. And though she didn't admit it out loud, she feared the collapse had already begun. The envelope was placed on her breakfast table, carefully folded beside a croissant and an imported orange juice she hadn't poured. It bore the Whitaker family crest, embossed gold on ivory. Arielle stared at it as if it were a ticking device. She didn't touch it for an hour. When she finally peeled it open, a cold draft swept her chest. A full-page prenuptial contract, drafted by Cynthia's legal team, filled with complex clauses about non-commingled inheritance protection, non-disclosure arbitration terms, and lifestyle clauses in case of scandal. But it wasn't the legal jargon that hurt, it was the small, handwritten note Cynthia tucked beside it. A woman with true dignity knows how to separate love from legacy. Please sign before next week's brunch. Arielle reread the line over and over. Her fingers trembled. She hadn't asked for any of this. She loved Graham, not his mother's empire. But Cynthia didn't see her as a bride. She saw her as a liability that needed taming. When Arielle confronted Graham later that night, he seemed caught between shame and resignation. I told her it wasn't necessary, he murmured, pacing their living room like a caged animal. But she's just trying to protect the family holdings. This is how she operates. Arielle's jaw clenched. And what about how I operate? You think I'm marrying you for money? Graham approached her gently, but she pulled away. His silence was answer enough. That night, while he slept beside her, Arielle sat in the hallway with her laptop and opened an old file she hadn't touched in years, SafeTrace, Proposal Draft V.0.1. Her long-forgotten business plan. Her dream. She scrolled through the sections: risk mitigation, executive mobility logistics, cyber surveillance infrastructure. She began editing, line by line, digit by digit, as if trying to reclaim the pieces of herself she had shelved to become bride material. The sun rose before she slept. Her soul ached, but her spine stayed straight. In the days that followed, Arielle reached out to Elias Chang, whose architectural thesis on secure flow mapping she remembered from a design conference Marina had once dragged her to. She invited him for coffee, under the pretense of catching up, but what started as small talk quickly turned into brainstorming. If I wanted to design a scalable security consultancy model from scratch, how would I start? She asked, and Elias's eyes lit up. He sketched diagrams on napkins, laid out infrastructure tiers, and offered to digitize her rough concepts. As they leaned over the table, Marina walked in unexpectedly and raised an eyebrow, then smirked. Look at you two, plotting an empire. Arielle smiled, but it faded quickly. She hadn't told them about the contract. Not yet. But something in her gut told her the Whitakers weren't finished playing chess. And if she didn't start making moves of her own, she'd be their pawn forever. Marina rented out a rooftop lounge in downtown Seattle for the bachelorette party, lavish yet tasteful, dressed in silver lanterns, silk drapes, and low jazz that slowly morphed into dance beats. Arielle arrived in a sapphire velvet wrap dress, her hair pulled into an elegant twist, the night air crisp against her skin. She smiled, toasted with mocktails, and let herself laugh when Marina presented a game involving truth cards and ridiculous dares. But underneath the glamour, something inside her felt unsteady, like a high wire pulled too tight. Trevor didn't show. Elias came briefly to drop off a gift box filled with hand-carved nameplates for the bridal table, then quietly slipped away. As the night wore on, Marina noticed Arielle's distant gaze and whispered, "You're allowed to be happy, you know." Arielle forced a nod, grateful for Marina's efforts. But deep down, she felt like she was watching someone else live her life, a perfectly curated version she couldn't fully believe anymore. Elsewhere, in a private cigar lounge rented by one of Graham's groomsmen, the bachelor party was already in full swing. Between poker games and vintage scotch tastings, Graham nursed a headache and checked his phone repeatedly. Cynthia had sent him 2 messages that day, both reminding him that a man must always control the narrative. It was vague but unmistakably pointed. Then, as the night pushed into its 3rd hour, the door opened and in walked Shayla Caldwell, draped in crimson satin, her presence sharp as a blade. The room went quiet for a beat. Graham stood up immediately. "You shouldn't be here," he hissed. Shayla shrugged. "You invited the same circle of friends we used to party with. What did you expect?" As the groomsmen returned to their drinks, pretending not to listen, Graham pulled her aside. Shayla leaned in too close, her perfume overwhelming. "I just want a moment." "Closure," she said with a smile. But her phone was recording in her purse. She had no interest in closure. She was staging ammunition. Marina received the footage from an anonymous sender less than 12 hours later. It showed Shayla entering Graham's suite. The timestamp was just past midnight. There was no footage of her leaving. Marina replayed it again and again, bile rising in her throat. She debated what to do, show Arielle now and risk ruining everything, or wait until she had undeniable proof of what really happened inside that room. She chose the latter. When she met Arielle the next morning for brunch, she said nothing. Arielle, glowing and distracted with seating charts and floral options, didn't notice the way Marina's hands trembled slightly over her coffee. But a storm had quietly begun to brew. One that would shatter every illusion Arielle clung to. And when it finally arrived, it wouldn't knock. It would crash in, uninvited, the way betrayal always does. The glasswood conservatory looked like something lifted from a dream. Sunlight streamed through the grand arched panels of glass that kissed the clouds, casting prisms of color over cascading orchids, moss-lined fountains, and imported cherry blossom trees flown in from Kyoto. Arielle stood in the center aisle, heels echoing off polished stone, her heart a tangle of emotion. This was the final walkthrough. Her wedding day was 72 hours away. Every detail was in place, vendors confirmed, seating charts printed, dress alterations finalized, but something inside her had quieted into a strange, aching stillness. Graham had grown increasingly distant, always taking last-minute calls, stepping out of rooms when his phone buzzed. When she mentioned it, he brushed her off gently, just final logistics, babe. It's nothing. But nothing had never felt so loud. As the planner led her to inspect the florals lining the archway, Arielle turned her face slightly and whispered, almost to herself, "Why do I feel like something's ending instead of beginning?" That same afternoon, tensions boiled quietly in the Donovan household. Stanley, Arielle's father, had taken the day off to help Trevor prep a speech he wanted to deliver at the rehearsal dinner. "I owe her at least that," Trevor said, his eyes clearer than they'd been in weeks. But when Stanley knocked on Trevor's door around noon, there was no answer. By 3 p.m., they were calling his phone repeatedly. At 5 p.m., a neighbor reported seeing Trevor heading toward Capitol Hill on foot, looking disoriented. Arielle, still in her rehearsal dress from earlier fittings, tore out of the house without hesitation, ignoring her father's protest. She checked his usual hangouts, shelters, and finally the bridge near Jackson Park, where he once admitted he'd gone during his lowest moments. By 9:30 p.m., she found him curled on a bench, trembling from cold and shame. "I'm so sorry, Ari," he whispered. "I didn't mean to slip. I was just scared." She helped him up, silent, heart-heavy, her dress stained by city dirt and despair. By the time she got home, she had missed the entire rehearsal dinner. Marina's frantic messages had flooded her phone, questions, updates, calls from the planner. Arielle didn't respond. She showered in silence, dried her curls with trembling fingers, and stared at herself in the mirror. Her reflection looked like a stranger. Her eyes were raw, the skin around them tired and bruised by responsibility. Graham never called to ask where she was. Not once. He sent a short text, "Hope everything's okay. Let me know when you're back." No mention of the missed rehearsal. No questions. No concern. That night, Arielle sat beside Trevor on the living room floor, watching him sleep on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, his breath steadying. Her family was fragile, but real. And as the night deepened, one truth grew louder in her heart: love should never make you feel disposable. The wedding was tomorrow. But her spirit had already begun to fracture. The eve of the wedding was cloaked in unsettling quiet. The morning had passed in a flurry of final gown steaming, makeup test runs, and delivery confirmations, but as dusk fell, a strange stillness settled over everything. Arielle sat on the window ledge of her childhood bedroom, the very room where she once scribbled wedding dreams into a leather-bound diary. But none of this felt like she imagined. Her heart wasn't soaring, it was searching. She had just finished writing her vows by hand, on thick cream stationery, every word dripping with vulnerability. "I choose you. Not for what the world sees, but for the peace you bring me." But when she reread the final line, she paused. Peace. Did she feel that anymore? Her instincts screamed under the silence, but she kept suppressing them. Surely every bride had nerves, right? Yet this didn't feel like nerves. It felt like standing in the eye of a hurricane, waiting for the next gust to rip through. Across the city, inside a dimly lit penthouse suite at the Carlton Grand, Graham poured a double of bourbon and stared out over the skyline. His groomsmen had all left earlier after a tense and unusually short gathering. He had claimed exhaustion. In truth, he needed space. Time to think. Time to reflect on a call he'd just made. The call had been brief. He dialed Shayla, who answered on the second ring. "It's done," he'd said. "I don't want her humiliated. I need out." Shayla had paused, then said with honeyed cruelty, "You're always doing the right thing in the worst possible way, Graham." After the call ended, he stood there paralyzed, ring box still on the desk behind him. He felt hollow. He hadn't meant for it to go this far. But Cynthia's constant pressure, Shayla's reappearance, and the tightening noose of his own guilt had cornered him. He told himself it was mercy. That leaving now was better than leaving later. But that was a lie. It was cowardice. Back at the Donovan house, Marina came by unannounced with a bottle of wine and a look on her face that said she wasn't there for celebration. "I'm getting bad feelings, Ari," she confessed as she helped Arielle fold her veil. "Something about this whole week feels off. I don't trust him. I don't trust them." Arielle didn't argue. She just sat quietly, folding napkins for no reason, her hands desperate for distraction. Then, around 11:37 p.m., Arielle's phone lit up with a missed call from a blocked number. No voicemail. She stared at it, waiting. A minute later, she got a second call, this time from an unknown number in Bellevue, Shayla's last known location. Again, no message. Marina leaned in and asked, "Do you want me to trace it?" Arielle hesitated, then shook her head. Not tonight. But in her heart, she already knew, whatever was coming, it would strike tomorrow. And there'd be no veil thick enough to hide from it. The morning of the wedding began with a kind of deceptive grace. The glasswood conservatory shimmered in the sun, its pristine glass reflecting a sky that looked too perfect to betray anyone. Guests arrived in clusters, dressed in elegance, laughter bubbling like champagne as violinists played softly near the entrance. Arielle stood in the bridal suite, her gown a masterpiece of ivory and satin, her hair swept into a braided crown that shimmered with golden pins. Marina zipped her in and whispered, "You've never looked more like yourself." But beneath the beauty was a woman hollowed by dread. Her hands trembled as she clutched her bouquet. Her heart beat unevenly, like it was warning her, "Don't go." She stared at the mirror, waiting for the final knock. The planner entered, beaming. "You're on in 5. Arielle stood. Smiled. Breathed. The doors opened. She stepped into the aisle, completely unaware that the man waiting at the end was no longer there. At first, it wasn't obvious. The guests stood as the music swelled. Arielle walked with measured poise, each step echoing between the cascading orchids and glass walls. It wasn't until she reached the halfway mark that she noticed the odd glances, the whisper between Cynthia and the officiant, the fact that the groom's side looked unsettled. Her father looked at her, confused, then toward the altar, where no one stood. No groom. No Graham. The music faded awkwardly. The air thickened. The officiant leaned into Cynthia, and Arielle caught the words, "Has anyone heard from him?" Her legs suddenly weighed twice their size. She looked toward Marina in the second row, who had already stood, searching for someone. Then the planner rushed in, discreetly pushing past chairs, and handed Arielle a folded cream note, short, handwritten, and shaking slightly. The world froze as she read it. "I'm sorry. I can't do this." That was all. No name. No explanation. Just a coward silence scrawled in ink. Arielle didn't collapse immediately. She stood, stunned, arms locked around the bouquet like a lifeline, eyes refusing to accept what her heart had already begun to scream. Then, her knees buckled. Marina caught her just before she hit the floor, and guests rushed forward in murmured panic. Cynthia Whitaker didn't move. She simply turned her head and whispered something to her assistant before walking out with Shayla on her arm, her expression calm, victorious. Camera phones flashed. A photographer dropped his lens. Trevor shoved past people to reach Arielle, rage boiling through his body. The entire hall erupted into chaos. But Arielle didn't hear any of it. Her world had gone silent, her vision dimmed by waves of disbelief and humiliation. She couldn't breathe. Couldn't cry. Couldn't speak. All she could do was hold the note, crushed now in her palm, and whisper one question in her mind again and again. Why? Why now? Why like this? The days after the wedding became a blur of blurred headlines, voicemail apologies, and sympathy flowers she never asked for. Arielle didn't respond to any of them. She left her phone in a drawer, turned off the lights in her apartment, and vanished into the quiet. Marina stayed with her for the first week, sleeping on the couch and refusing to leave her alone even when Arielle insisted. I don't want to be pitied, Arielle whispered one morning, staring out the window as snow began to fall unseasonably early. You're not pitied, Marina said. You're loved. And right now, you're in shock. By the end of the second week, Arielle packed a single suitcase, kissed her father on the forehead without a word, and left Seattle. She told no one where she was going. Not even Marina. The wedding dress remained in the back of her closet, untouched, still wrapped in plastic. Just like her voice. Just like her future. In the absence of Arielle, rumors spread like wildfire. Social media whispered theories. Some blamed Graham's cold feet, others hinted that Arielle had found out a secret and called it off herself. Cynthia released a carefully crafted statement to Seattle Scene magazine, claiming Graham had been suffering a personal crisis and that the family supported his decision to pause the engagement for his well-being. It was a masterclass in deflection. Shayla, meanwhile, posted a photo from Tuscany with the caption "New Beginnings." The cruelty was not in their words but in their ease. Back in Seattle, Trevor, now sober again, checked into Crescent Path Recovery, this time without prompting. I let her down, he admitted during intake. Elias moved into a studio above a coffee shop and threw himself into freelance design work. Marina became colder in the hospital, her patients noticed, her colleagues whispered, but she didn't care. Her best friend had been destroyed in plain view, and no one was answering for it. Everyone was moving on. But not one person asked how the fire started. 6 months passed before anyone heard from Arielle again. It was Marina who first spotted her, blurry, almost unrecognizable, in a background clip on a local news segment about a remote fishing town near the Oregon coast. She wasn't giving a statement, just walking across a dock, her hair darker, her frame leaner, dressed in a gray windbreaker and boots. Elias rewound the clip 10 times. "That's her," he said softly. "She's alive." But the woman in the video didn't look like the Arielle they knew. Her eyes were focused, her stride firm. There was no trace of the woman who once cried over peonies and veil fabric. She had disappeared, but not to hide. She was surviving. Reinventing. Somewhere no one could reach her. Somewhere she could learn to breathe again without being anyone's perfect bride or broken victim. And as the first snows of winter dusted Seattle, the city she left behind waited in silence, unaware that a storm far stronger was preparing to return. The town of Astoria Bay was not on any map of glamour or second chances. Nestled along the jagged Oregon coast, it smelled of salt, rust, and something older, like forgotten dreams. Arielle had taken up work as an emergency dispatcher, training under a former state responder named Darla Moreno, a gruff but kind-eyed woman who never asked too many questions. Arielle worked night shifts, 12 hours straight, answering calls that were never glamorous, domestic violence reports, stroke victims, children locked in bathrooms, but every time the phone rang, she was present, sharp, calm. Her voice, once reserved for charming corporate guests, now saved lives. Darla often watched her in silence, sensing the steel beneath her quiet. Arielle never spoke of who she was or what she had been. She had shed the name Donovan entirely, going by El Dov, a truncated version of herself, lighter, detached. It wasn't a disguise. It was a rebirth through ashes. The town accepted her because she didn't demand it. Locals knew not to pry. The sea taught them that some things buried deep were meant to stay that way. She rented a small cottage with worn blue shutters and a leaky roof, and she learned how to fix plumbing, chop wood, and survive on peanut butter and day-old bread. On weekends, she hiked coastal trails alone, battling cliffs and fog, trying to reclaim her breath. Occasionally, she sat in the back of Cove Diner, sipping bitter coffee and scribbling in a small leather notebook, security infrastructure designs, contingency blueprints, sometimes just lists of what she would need to build her own company from scratch. She still had the original SafeTrace draft saved on a flash drive, buried under books in a coffee tin. She wasn't ready yet, but the embers were glowing again. Reinvention wasn't about flipping a switch. It was about lighting one match at a time and choosing to keep it burning. 3 months into her life as El Dov, the town faced a terrifying emergency, a factory fire at Torrance Packaging, with 6 employees trapped inside. The first 911 call came in garbled and panicked. Arielle answered, her voice slicing through the static like glass. She coordinated with local responders, rerouted traffic, and located a collapsed stairwell from floor plans she remembered scanning during a routine drill. Her precision saved lives that night. The fire chief personally came to the dispatch center to thank her. "You kept your cool better than some of my men," he said. Darla just grinned. That night, Arielle walked home alone, her coat soaked with sea mist, her fingers trembling not from fear, but from something else, awakening. For the first time in months, she slept without nightmares. She had been thrown into fire, again and again. But this time, she hadn't burned. She had forged something. And though no one yet knew her name, she was beginning to remember it herself. It started with a handwritten thank you letter, mailed, not emailed, from the daughter of the Torrance Packaging CEO. Her father had survived the fire because of Arielle's dispatch precision, and that gratitude came with more than kind words. It came with a request, private security consultation. At first, Arielle declined. She wasn't a company. She wasn't even sure she was herself yet. But when the girl, Juliana Torrance, visited her cottage in person, 23, sharp, and fierce with inherited wealth, Arielle listened. Juliana wanted help vetting and rebuilding her family's executive safety systems after realizing how unprepared they were. "You saw what we missed," she said. "You think like a tactician." The proposal sparked something long dormant in Arielle. That night, she pulled the flash drive from its tin, opened SafeTrace for the first time in over a year, and began rewriting, streamlining services, updating logistics, building it not for perfection, but for execution. It would be discreet, quiet, elite. A fortress behind a name no one had ever heard of. With Elias's architectural support, rekindled through emails Marina forwarded without permission, Arielle designed a modular office unit that could be installed inside an abandoned dockside warehouse just outside Astoria Bay. It was all steel, tempered glass, and silence, clean, minimal, and untraceable to her past. Elias sent the blueprints without asking questions, his subject line simple, "When you're ready, I'm here." Using her dispatcher savings and a small grant Juliana helped her secure through a local entrepreneur fund, Arielle hired 3 contractors to help with the fit-out, 2 veterans, and a tech-savvy single mother who once worked in counter-surveillance. She trained quietly, stayed anonymous, built relationships on competence, not charisma. SafeTrace was born in silence but structured like an empire. Within weeks, the company had 3 small-scale contracts, including one to manage discreet security during a high-profile divorce negotiation in Portland. Arielle didn't attend the meetings in person. She managed everything through layers, blind routers, secured servers, voice-only communication. She didn't need visibility. She wanted control. And this time, she had it. Meanwhile, her brother Trevor resurfaced, not as a shadow of his old self, but as something startlingly new. Now clean for over a year, he had completed a vocational program in logistics and applied for a security handler position at Safetrace without knowing she was the founder. Arielle saw his resume in the applicant stack and nearly dropped her tea. Instead of calling him, she ran a full background check, watched his sober milestones, and offered him a trial role under a pseudonym. He excelled. He had changed. Arielle, still L in public records, watched from behind a wall of encrypted reports and scheduled contracts. Marina visited only once, stepping into the minimalist space, eyes wide and full of disbelief. "You did this," she whispered. Arielle nodded. But inside, she knew she wasn't finished. This wasn't about revenge. This was about reclaiming the version of herself that had been buried beneath betrayal, expectation, and the wreckage of almost. She was rising, but quietly. And no one saw her coming. The ballroom of the Aurora Harbor Museum sparkled with crystal chandeliers and soft classical music during the silent auction hosted by the Whitestone Children's Fund, an event frequented by Seattle's elite. Arielle, now publicly known in executive circles as El Dove, attended at the discreet request of a high-profile client who wanted Safetrace to assess venue vulnerabilities during high-value auctions. She wore a sleek black column dress, her hair in a twisted bun, a subtle earpiece nestled in her right ear, and a small notepad in her clutch. She was observing, not participating. But halfway through the evening, as she walked past the reflective wall installation near the silent bid table, she paused. Across the room, Graham Whitaker stood beside a silver sculpture, drink in hand, gaze heavy with loss. He was thinner, suit wrinkled, hair unkempt. And in the silence that wrapped around them, his eyes locked onto hers, brows furrowed, a bead of confusion flashing. Then uncertainty. Then disbelief. But not recognition. She didn't flinch. She didn't smile. She simply nodded and walked past him like a stranger. But inside her chest, something sharp curled, memories attempting to resurface, pulled back down by sheer force of will. Graham turned slowly, following her with his eyes. He approached cautiously, stumbling through a conversation with another guest just to break away. "Excuse me," he said softly, reaching for her elbow as she paused beside the buffet. "I'm sorry. Do I know you from somewhere?" Arielle turned slowly, met his eyes without blinking, and replied in a clipped tone, "I don't believe so." Her voice had changed, sharper, colder, devoid of the warmth he once knew. "Right," he said, clearly embarrassed, stepping back. "You just reminded me of someone." He didn't press further. He wouldn't dare. Arielle drifted toward the exit, her back straight. But outside, under the winter night sky, she allowed herself a breath. Not of grief. Not of nostalgia. Of victory. He didn't recognize her because he'd never truly seen her at all. Inside, Graham returned to his seat next to Shayla, who now wore the faded elegance of a woman clinging to status that no longer welcomed her. Their marriage was strained, barely held together by finances, public appearances, and a childless silence that grew heavier with each passing month. Graham had lost his equity in the family business after making a disastrous investment without Cynthia's approval. His mother had distanced herself publicly. Whitaker Holdings was under scrutiny. He had become a name with no foundation. Shayla, bitter and impatient, sipped champagne and scrolled through photos on her phone. "What are you looking at?" he asked. "Nothing," she snapped. But on her screen was a paused security still, a woman in black with piercing eyes, standing alone in the venue's camera feed. She tilted her head, zoomed in slowly. Her lips parted. "El Dove," she whispered under her breath, unsure if it was a coincidence or karma wearing stilettos. But she knew this, they hadn't seen the last of her. It began with a contract. Safetrace had received a high-priority inquiry through its encrypted corporate portal, anonymous at first, with a request for full-site security restructuring at a multi-tower commercial complex in downtown Seattle. Arielle read through the specs, something flickering at the back of her mind. It wasn't until she saw the architectural imprint on the footer, Whitaker Corporate Development, that she understood fate had stopped waiting and had come knocking. The towers were one of Cynthia Whitaker's legacy holdings, and with Graham's assets frozen from a failed merger, Cynthia had stepped back into operational control. The irony was delicious. Cynthia needed her. The woman who had once tried to erase her worth was now unknowingly asking her to protect hers. Arielle didn't hesitate. She set a meeting, in person, under her operating alias, E. D. Vaughn, founder and director of SafeTrace. When she walked into the Whitaker boardroom 3 days later in a steel gray pantsuit, Cynthia's glass of mineral water trembled on the coaster. "Thank you for coming on such short notice," Cynthia began, composed but caught off guard. "I was expecting your project manager." Arielle offered a firm handshake. "He works under me. I thought this meeting required my attention." She sat down without waiting to be invited. Cynthia's assistant, clueless, projected the security weaknesses onto the screen, but Cynthia couldn't look away from the woman across the table. The voice was familiar. So were the eyes. Yet she couldn't place her. Arielle clicked through vulnerabilities with surgical precision, pointing out lapses in the ground access protocols, blind surveillance zones, and compromised subcontractor trails. "If these aren't addressed," she said coolly, "a breach is not a matter of if, but when." Cynthia bristled. "And how much are we expected to pay for this?" "Salvation?" Arielle slid a thick envelope across the table. "Full payment up front. No exceptions. No negotiations. And a confidentiality clause that names me sole architect of the redesign. Or you can find someone else." Cynthia blinked. No one spoke to her like that. Not even her own board. After a long pause, Cynthia leaned back slowly, folding her arms. "You remind me of someone I underestimated once," she said, her tone dipped in calculation. Arielle smiled. "People often do. Until they can't afford to." The silence between them was sharp as glass. Cynthia eventually signed the agreement with tight fingers, her pride chewing on every stroke of the pen. Arielle stood, gathered her documents, and offered a final nod. "You'll receive deployment updates by Monday." She walked out, heels striking like a metronome of power. Outside, she didn't exhale until the cold air hit her skin. But it wasn't relief, it was the taste of victory. She hadn't shouted. She hadn't demanded revenge. She'd simply become the kind of woman people couldn't ignore. Cynthia had no idea who she truly was. But Arielle didn't need her to remember. All that mattered was that the empire Cynthia had tried to gatekeep now depended on the brilliance of the woman she once tried to discard. The spring sun broke through the storm-gray clouds over Seattle like a quiet apology. It was the first warm Saturday in weeks, and Marina insisted on dragging Arielle out of her fortress. They walked through Green Lake Park, passing runners and families on bikes, while children fed breadcrumbs to ducks. It felt surreal, almost staged, as if life had gone on too easily. Arielle wore sunglasses and kept her hair pinned low, still cautious in public. Marina chatted about hospital politics and flirted with the idea of taking a research fellowship in Boston, but she kept glancing sideways. "You don't laugh anymore," she finally said. Arielle paused near the railing overlooking the lake. "I don't feel like I've earned it yet." Marina squeezed her hand and pointed across the lake to a group of EMT trainees running drills. "You saved lives. You've built something people can't even dream of. If that's not worthy of joy, I don't know what is." But Arielle didn't answer. Not yet. That same weekend, SafeTrace intercepted a cyber attack targeting St. Graceland's Memorial Hospital, where Marina worked. The hackers had embedded ransomware into the network through a third-party maintenance vendor. Arielle's team flagged it early, and within hours, had locked down the breach, traced the malware to a server in Lisbon, and prevented it from wiping decades of patient data. No one at the hospital ever knew how close they'd come to collapse, only that a consulting firm stepped in. Marina, suspicious, cornered Arielle in her office Monday morning. "Was that you?" Arielle shrugged. "Hypothetically?" Marina pulled her into a hug so tight, it nearly cracked Arielle's ribs. Later that day, A bouquet of wildflowers was delivered to Safetrace lobby. The card read, "You're more than just brilliant, Elle. You're good. Truly good." It wasn't signed, but Arielle knew the handwriting. Elias Chang. He had started writing her quietly again, checking in with steady, careful admiration. He never asked for anything. And that was exactly why his presence began to matter again. That night, as Arielle sorted through her old journals and notes in a rare moment of stillness, she opened a storage crate she hadn't touched since leaving Seattle. Inside was a sealed brown envelope marked in her mother's delicate script, "For Arielle, not before you're ready." Her breath caught. She sat down slowly, heart pounding, hands trembling as she peeled the seal. Inside was a letter, dated nearly a decade ago, and a copy of a document, an anonymous report filed against Whitaker Holdings for labor abuse and offshore embezzlement. Her mother had been the whistleblower. The report had gone nowhere. 6 months later, her mother was pushed into early retirement after an anonymous complaint questioned her mental stability. Arielle dropped the papers. Her chest was heaving. Suddenly, everything clicked: why Cynthia hated her mother's name, why she dismissed Arielle as unstable stock, why her engagement was never about love. This wasn't a breakup. This had always been a war. And it had started long before the wedding. Arielle read the letter 5 times that night. Each word felt like glass in her throat. Her mother's handwriting, once a source of bedtime warmth and birthday cards, now outlined an unspeakable truth: Lenora Donovan had been professionally assassinated by Cynthia Whitaker. The letter was never bitter, it was calm, factual, heartbreakingly restrained. It detailed how Lenora discovered falsified labor contracts and offshore funneling within Whitaker Holdings. She had filed a whistleblower report through a secure channel, only to face internal retaliation weeks later, anonymous mental evaluations, suspiciously timed accusations, and sudden dismissal. "I know I may not survive the reputation damage," the final lines read, "but I pray this truth finds you one day, and that you are strong enough to do what I couldn't." Arielle sat at her desk as the letter trembled in her hands. She was no longer just a woman betrayed at the altar. She was the daughter of a silenced voice, and now, that voice had returned. She spent the next several days like a ghost moving through fire. Every call, every plan, every client meeting was handled flawlessly, but her mind burned with vengeance and clarity. Arielle hired a digital forensic investigator, B. Sinclair, a former cybercrime specialist turned rogue analyst, who agreed to trace back the original report trail, recover deleted communications, and unmask who within Whitaker Holdings buried it. "You're not the first person they tried to bury," B said bluntly. Arielle didn't flinch. With Marina's legal contacts and Trevor handling logistics, Safetrace assembled a silent task force, not for violence, but for exposure. They cross-referenced Lenora's notes with current financial patterns, tracking where Cynthia's shell companies still laundered funds through obscure vendors. The corruption ran deeper than expected. Offshore slush accounts, ghost employees, compromised audits. All of it protected by years of silence, privilege, and careful fear. But Cynthia hadn't counted on the one thing that unraveled dynasties, the child of the woman she tried to erase, armed with purpose, precision, and nothing left to lose. Meanwhile, Elias noticed a change in Arielle's energy: sharper, sleepless, consumed. One night, he stopped by the Safetrace office with no appointment, just 2 coffees and concern. "Talk to me," he said gently. She didn't. Not at first. But eventually, she led him into the back room, where all the evidence was mapped across glass panels. The timeline, the accounts, the signatures. "She destroyed my mother," Arielle said, her voice hollow. This was never about Graham. I was collateral." Elias took it in slowly. He didn't offer pity. He simply stepped forward, placed his hand over hers, and said, "Then let's finish it the right way." For the first time since the letter, she breathed. Not because she was fine, but because she was understood. In that moment, there was no more Dove. There was only Arielle Donovan, daughter of Lenora, founder of SafeTrace, and the quiet storm that would bring Cynthia Whitaker's empire to its knees. It started with an anonymous leak to 3 independent financial crime journalists, each handed a digital dossier compiled by Arielle and B. Sinclair. The files were airtight, timestamped records, offshore wire transfers, whistleblower suppression logs, falsified employment rosters, and internal emails signed off by Cynthia Whitaker herself. Within 48 hours, Whitaker Holdings was trending for all the wrong reasons. News broke during a morning live broadcast. Cynthia's face, once plastered on charity boards and economic panels, now occupied the top right corner of investigative exposés. The Department of Financial Regulation launched a formal inquiry within hours. By evening, FBI agents escorted Cynthia out of a shareholder meeting in handcuffs, stoic, red-lipped, but pale beneath her usual power armor. Graham, stunned and silent, sat watching the coverage alone in the penthouse he once shared with Arielle. Shayla had left 2 weeks prior, drained his accounts, and fled to Europe with the last of his dignity. The Whitaker name had fallen. But Arielle hadn't even blinked. That afternoon, she mailed one small envelope to Graham's building, no return address. Inside was the very note he'd left her on their wedding day. "I'm sorry. I can't do this." Folded beneath it was a handwritten message in elegant, silver ink, "Thank you." It wasn't revenge. It was closure. Without his cowardice, she might never have rediscovered her mother's truth, her own strength, or the life she was truly meant to live. Graham read it 3 times, unable to tell if it stung or soothed. He spent the evening sitting by the same window where he once imagined a future with her. Only now, he was just another man who underestimated the quiet girl at the front desk. Meanwhile, Marina received a congratulatory email from her hospital board. Thanks to the attack Arielle's team had prevented, she was nominated for a national award in medical operations. Trevor, clean and thriving, had been promoted to regional logistics coordinator at SafeTrace. And B. Sinclair? She sent Arielle a single-line message: "If you ever want to burn another dragon, I'm in." That evening, as the sun dipped over the quiet coastal skyline, Arielle invited Elias to the cliffside villa she had quietly purchased under a trust, built on land her mother once sketched in a journal, titled Someday. They stood barefoot on the grass, the wind tugging gently at her dress, as Elias stared at the property with awe. This is peace," he whispered. Arielle nodded. There were no press cameras. No social media announcements. No speeches. Just 2 people, surrounded by silence and salt air. Elias turned to her. "And us?" She didn't answer with words. She leaned in and kissed him, firm, certain, and without hesitation. She had nothing left to prove. No image to preserve. She was no longer someone waiting to be chosen. She was the one doing the choosing. And for once, her future didn't look like a second-hand fairy tale. It looked like freedom. Tomorrow could wait. For tonight, she had finally arrived, whole. 1 year after the fall of Whitaker Holdings, the name SafeTrace Global appeared on the Forbes list of fastest-growing private intelligence firms. But its founder, Arielle Donovan, remained a mystery. Her public profile was minimal: no interviews, no photos, no speeches. Yet behind that purposeful anonymity, Arielle was building something greater than visibility. Her new headquarters sat nestled above the cliffs of High Ridge Point, overlooking the Pacific, shaped like a fortress of glass and steel, architected by Elias, now her partner in both design and devotion. Inside, the space echoed with quiet purpose, walls lined with encrypted servers, a war room of global threat matrices, and a sanctuary where strategy met justice. She hired survivors, the overlooked, the forgotten. Those who, like her, had been dismissed and discarded. To the world, she was a shadow figure. But within her carefully chosen circle, she was a lighthouse, steady, unshakable, and finally free from the wreckage that once defined her. On a soft April morning, Arielle stood barefoot in the private greenhouse behind the villa, pressing her palm against the glass. Rows of orchids surrounded her, her mother's favorite flower. A new breed had bloomed this season, one she'd quietly cultivated from a hybrid seed. She named it Lenora's Grace. That afternoon, Trevor arrived with documents for a second SafeTrace site opening in Atlanta, carrying fresh-baked bread and the latest updates from his sobriety sponsor. Marina video called from Boston, where she'd begun a research fellowship and was now secretly dating a pediatric surgeon she once claimed to loathe. And Elias? He was building a tiny private retreat for them 2 ridges south, where they could someday unplug entirely. But Arielle wasn't rushing. She moved with intention now, her decisions rooted in clarity, not reaction. She no longer flinched at shadows or silences. What had once broken her had now shaped her. She had become her mother's legacy, and her own. That evening, as the ocean swallowed the sun and cast gold across the water, Arielle lit a single candle and placed it by her mother's journal. "You were right," she whispered. "I found the strength. I found the truth." She turned off her phone. No meetings. No alarms. Just waves. When Elias joined her on the deck with 2 cups of tea and a blanket, she leaned into him, not because she needed to, but because she wanted to. And that, more than anything, was the difference. The girl who had once stood frozen at the altar no longer lived here. In her place was a woman forged in silence, fire, and resilience. A woman who built an empire from pain and named it peace. As night fell over High Ridge Point, Arielle closed her eyes and smiled, not for what she had overcome, but for everything that now awaited her. This wasn't the end. It was, finally and beautifully, a new beginning. The end.